Our first speaker is Ozren Pupovac. He teaches philosophy and critical theory at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Rijeka, where he heads the Center for Theoretical and Critical Research. His work focuses on contemporary French philosophy, Marxist theories of politics and emancipation, the speculative legacy of German idealism, and the question of the subject. He published on Marxist philosophy and the post-Yugoslav political context and translated works of Badiou, Rancière, Lazaris, and Althusser in Serbo-Croatian. Since 2008, he runs together with Bruno Bessana the Versus Laboratory Research Platform. So, please.
So, thank you, Jelica, for this invitation. The title of my intervention today is The Limit of Interpellation. And where to begin? There has been a certain tendency of reading, no doubt authorized by Althusser himself, and productive, very productive in the city in which we find ourselves today, a tendency of reading which asserts that Althusser and Lacan stand in an intimate dialogue. And the center stage of this dialogue seems to be precisely oriented around the figure of interpellation, and with a famous scene of the hailing of individuals as subjects. And at first glance, isn't it really that interpellation seems as an opening of the problematic of Marxism towards psychoanalysis? Isn't it that interpellation presents precisely the point of a synthesis of a specific interiority, the interiority of subjectivity, the interiority of consciousness or of the unconscious, and at the same time, the exteriority of societal determinations? With the hailing of individuals as subjects, do we not precisely have a specific idea of the subjectivation of societal structure? Hailing, response, recognition, miscognition. Isn't Althusser fundamentally here borrowing and modeling his concepts upon psychoanalytic concepts? The mirror stage, for instance, the entire question of the ego identification as a response to the injunction of the other, the question of the entry into the symbolic order, and so forth. This has been a strong tendency of interpreting Althusser himself. And this tendency also proceeded to complement Althusser with a series of concepts of Lacan, precisely or primarily complementing Althusser with the Lacanian concept of the subject and the Lacanian theory of the subject. A theory of the subject which, as we know, in Lacan presupposes a specific coupling of the void, of the figure of the void, and that of the objet petit a. And this tendency precisely also suggested that one should complement Althusser with a certain dimension of the symbolic, inasmuch as interpellation, at least this was the dominant reading, has been modeled solely upon the imaginary, whereas the symbolic seems to be lacking. Now, this path of reading interpellation, as productive as it was, seems to me to miss the radicality of Althusser's propositions. It seems to me to miss the scope of Althusser's critique of the category of the subject. It seems to me to miss the originality of his project And specifically, it seems to me to miss the specificity of its purpose, the investment of thought vis-a-vis a specific contemporaneity, or at least a sketch of a certain possibility of locating thought in contemporaneity and for contemporaneity, a contemporaneity of politics and a contemporaneity of history. Now, what I will try to propose today is a second line of reading, a second possible interpretation of interpellation, where interpellation and Althusser is severed from the Lacanian complements. Because it seems to me that the prodigious nature of the concept reveals itself only when we do not read it as a genetic concept. So this is one of my key points, that interpellation is not a genetic concept. It does not concern the passage from an individual to a subject. It does not concern a specific temporality or a causality of subjectivation. It is not a scene of the entry into the symbolic order. My claim today would be that grasping the originality of Althusser's project demands a reading of Althusser, of interpellation, as a limit concept. A concept invested, on the one hand, in an incessant crossing of a limit between different registers, between philosophy on the one hand, and on the other hand, a certain theory of historical or societal objectivity, in Althusser's terms, which seem to belong to a different age today, a crossing between dialectical materialism and historical materialism, a crossing, if we can abstract from today's perspective, between a determination of thought in its ruptural interventionist form, on the one hand, and on the other hand, thought figuring in the form of the cognition of an object. So this is one way of interpreting what I mean by a limit concept. So constant torsion, if I can call it, between philosophy and objectivity. But at the same time, it is a concept which is invested in drawing a certain limit. Not only crossing a limit, but drawing, establishing an uncrossable limit. A divide between, on the one hand, everything which belongs to repetition, reproduction, stasis, and on the other hand, the question of the emergence of novelty, the question of the production of the new. Now, what I will attempt to present today is a sketch of this possible other reading of Althusser, as well as the implications of this reading for a certain line of what would it mean to go beyond interpellation, beyond the limit that interpellation actually establishes. And what I will try to show is that this actually takes us in the end towards a decisive interplay, a ruptural interplay between the question of knowledge and the question of political action. But I would like to begin by pointing out that within Althusser himself, there is a certain problem of the unsituability of the concept of interpellation. The question of where does it actually belong? To which terrain and in which actual domain is Althusser constructing his problematic? Where is the little theoretical theater, as he called it, of interpellation actually staged? In which register? Because we cannot not notice a certain slippage in Althusser's formulations themselves. The very form of mirroring, the so-called speculary relation, speculary structure, which is, of course, central for the construction of the concept of interpellation, a speculary structure which is constitutive for the explanation of the mechanism of ideology in its functioning of social relations, namely the functioning of individuals through the subject form, which assures the fact that they take up positions in the division of labor. In other words, the entire problematic of reproduction of relations of production and of the workings of the ideological state apparatuses, which function precisely in and through interpellation. This form of mirroring, which is central for Althusser's concept, is also present somewhere else. Namely, speculary relation as a form is critically formulated even before the concept of interpellation in Althusser, vis-à-vis his critique of the traditional philosophical theories of knowledge, vis-à-vis something that he defines as an elementary structure of ideological cognition, or a structure of ideology which is presupposed and reproduced in classical philosophical theories of knowledge, which he would precisely discard as idealist. The speculary relation, the speculary structure here functions precisely as a certain point of blockage, as a certain point of impossibility. A blockage of what? A blockage of the openness of the process of knowing. Let me quote from Lire Le Capital. The essence of ideology is to reduce cognition to a phenomenon of recognition. Or, in a more starker sense, a scientific theory is an open-ended discipline. An ideology, by contrast, is a closed system that produces nothing new, never ceasing to repeat itself because it has only one goal: to legitimate certain objectives established in advance. So the elementary structure of ideology is precisely speculatory. Or, in other words, the ideological form of cognition is a certain closed circle, rendered possible by a speculary relation, a constant reflection of presuppositions into results or goals, or vice versa, of goals on results into questions and problems. Thus, in the ideological form of cognition, we have answers which tailor themselves questions or problems as simple means of their recognition. We have a false posing of problems as simple reflex of solutions which are already formulated in advance. We have a constant production of the structure of recognition. For instance, ready-made answers, ready-made questions, ready-made means, techniques of inquiry, methods reduced to mere instruments, and all drawn into reducing knowing to recognizing. Now, if the ideological structure of cognition is one of recognition, it is at the same time also one of miscognition. Not in the sense of epistemological errors, but in the sense that the function of the closed circle, the function of circularity, is a reflection of something outside of the process of knowing itself. It is a reflection, according to Althusser, of a specific set of practical societal interests, of the very structure of existent society in its violent contradiction. If an ideological process or ideological posing of the process of cognition always involves a certain circularity, always blocking a certain critical impetus of knowledge, this means that such a structure is always a legitimation of the status quo. So in a certain sense, we have a process of cognition where the results of this process are defined outside of the process of knowing itself, which become theoretical mirrors and practical forms of legitimations of existent societal relations and existent practical interests. The speculatory structure, circularity, is itself a reflect and the means of reproduction of something outside itself, of relations of production. Another quote, but this time from the essay on the ideological state apparatuses. In ideology, all questions are thus settled in advance, in the nature of things, since ideological discourse interpellates or constitutes the individuals of interpellation by providing them in advance with the answer, with all the answers that the faint question that its interpellation contains. What we have here, if we analyze this general structure of interpellation as a certain cognitive blocking, as the very figure of idealism, as Althusser would claim, what we have is a peculiar folding of the problematic. Namely, interpellation, or the problem of interpellation, is at the same time an explanation of the reproduction of societal structures through subjectivation, through the recognition, miscognition of the self in and through an ideological discourse, invested in material, practical apparatuses. And at the same time, we have a form of an obscuration of the process of knowledge, the production of a deficient, false knowledges or representations. The fictive synthesis at the level of individual consciousness, triggered by ideological structures, precisely those fictive syntheses which enable the functioning of individuals, their insertion into societal functions, carried within the practices of ideological state apparatuses, these fictive syntheses, in fact, reflect the same elementary structure of a occlusion which is present in what Althusser would describe as a false circular process of cognition. In other words, and this is the entire paradox of Althusser's proposal and the difficulty of it, ideology is both, the problem of ideology is both that of a material social reality, even of a material force and objectivity, and at the same time the negative of science, the negative of the movement of knowledge. We have a folding of two problematics, precisely what Althusser would name historical materialism and dialectical materialism. Now, the key here to grasp and to render intelligible this theoretical construction of this fold is or resides in Althusser's entire attempt to undermine the category of the subject, which for him, in fact, is inseparable from his critique of the law and from his critique of the legal form, which to a large degree is also a critique of a certain symbolic, which means that at least at this point, Althusser does not need to be complemented with a Lacanian theory of the symbolic. Let us read, or let me read out, an extended formulation of the famous third thesis on ideology, which goes as follows. Ideology interpolates concrete individuals into concrete subjects by the functioning of the category of the subject. So ideology interpolates concrete individuals into concrete subjects by the functioning of the category of the subject. I think we need to note here that interpellation, if we take seriously what Althusser claims, namely this functioning of the category, interpellation is not a matter of a spontaneous miscognition. It does not have a certain structure of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is mediated by a specific external form, which is very evident in Althusser's quite violent attack, his critical attack on Marx's own schema of ideology in the first chapters of Das Kapital, namely the schema of commodity fetishism, which Althusser always considered to be too wedded to a specific spontaneous understanding of the reflection between consciousness and specific societal structures. The key here, so the functioning of the category of the subject, the external form which mediates interpellation, the key here is that the philosophical category of the subject carries a specific matrix. It is modeled upon something. Namely, according to Althusser, its matrix is juridical. It is essentially related, historically in its constitution, to bourgeois private law. The subject, at its base, is modeled upon the juridical persona as the possessor of himself or herself and of properties. The center stage here is occupied by a specific critique of the figure of guarantee, of legal guarantee. A guarantee whether of cognition, or of knowledge, or of a contract of a specific societal relation. How does Althusser proceed? Precisely by singling out, and this is a very classical critique that we find already in Marx. Legal guarantee is a specific abstraction and the separation of a form, a separation of form from contents. But precisely this separation of form from contents is a means or an instrument in their regulation, a means of keeping them in check. Thus, the juridical contract between two formally equal and free possessors occludes, of course, abstracts from, but also occludes the entire content of class relations, of class inequalities, of the material force of relations of production as such. But we have the same structure within the juridical setting of the problem of knowing. For instance, the famous theme of the conditions of possibility, as the establishment of a specific general framework for the organization and the intelligibility of phenomenal representations. The problem for Althusser is always that the category of the subject fixes the problem of knowledge. It provides it with a certain guarantee, with a point of reference, but it also limits it. It implies a specific reduction. In Kant, or at least in a specific Kant, we have the limitation of the work, for instance, of categories to the regulation of representations. The fixing of categories in their interplay, which are at the same time accorded with a certain sensible image, the fixing of categories to the regulation of empirical phenomena as such. And thus also a certain limit to what can be thought, the limit to cognition as such. So we have a fixation of a guarantee, but we also have a fixation of a method or of a criterion, a specific form of truth, a specific form of certainty. Law or legal or juridical conditioning always appears as a form, something which abstracts from contents, something which is formulated in a separation from contents, but solely in order to fix the limits of these contents, to reproduce at least in societal relations, to reproduce the status quo, the fait accompli of social relations as such. As I already noted, the classical Marxian critique of the law implies the critique of the abstraction of the juridical persona, inasmuch as it is precisely the formal nature of the law which occludes and thus also reproduces the contents that it regulates, class relations of production or the extraction of surplus value. So the abstraction and the separation of law as form is always a specific legitimation of the status quo, of the state of facts, without the need of force. For law is nothing but sedimented yet occluded force, which stands at its origin. At the same time, this separate form is not a horizon of senselessness. The critique of the law in Althusser is not a critique of a blind, automatic following of rules, but precisely the opposite. Law, in a certain sense, is the terrain of sense. Law provides sense, in as much as provides a criterion of regulation. It provides making sense of the existent through the enforcing of the recognition of its evidence. So, to sum up this twin critique of the legal form, if interpellation always possesses a certain legal matrix, if the subject as a category is a presupposition of a guarantee, a certain elementary form of evidence, as the substratum of thoughts, of action, of movements, always determining its direction and its limits. This means that interpellation fundamentally stands opposite to what? To the grasping of multiplicity and singularity. And we can find this expressed in quite a direct way in the following definition of ideology by Althusser, which I always found quite puzzling. Ideology is the misrecognition of the class nature and the complex nature of society. What is the relation between complexity, multiplicity, and class nature? Well, as a legal form, as a juridical form, the subject is always a presupposition of a synthesis, a certain external form, which is not only established through an indifference to content while masking and regulating it, but it is a specific form which miscognizes complexity, which reduces multiplicity. It reduces multiplicity to a prior unity. So, seen from this perspective, interpellation is a certain generalized figure of stasis, which works through a constant shifting of evidences, from the elementary synthesis of self-consciousness as primary evidence, the Cartesian cogito precisely in its texture, to the evidence of any of my external representations, social practices, actions, tasks. In fact, for Althusser, ideology is inseparable from practice as such, from the undertaking of practice. Or, if you want it, ideology or interpellation defines the entire general terrain of experience, precisely as a certain false terrain, a certain false societal practice, even if this falsity is not epistemic, it is material, because it is engaged in this incessant practical reproduction of the given. So, the generalized terrain of reproduction, which is rendered possible by interpellation, is also a generalized terrain of repetition. Thus, a very stark formulation. When nothing happens, the ideological state apparatuses have perfectly functioned. So, this is in brief one side of the limit of interpellation. As the scene of repetition, as the scene of circularity, as the scene of reproduction. But what is it that lies beyond it? What is it, and how does Althusser conceive of a beyond of interpellation if he does away with the category of the subject? And why does he do away with the category of the subject? Precisely because he wants to do away not simply with a certain idea of a prior synthesis, but also because he wants to do away with any idea of a dynamism, a possible dynamism, starting from the existence of a structure. So instead of the subject, we get the famous thematic of a process without a subject. And the thrust of the entirety of Althusser's project is to seek a certain opening, a certain conception of movement, which would break out of the circle of repetition, both within the terrain of knowing, but at the same time also within the terrain of history or within the terrain of societal relations, fundamentally within the terrain of politics. So an opening in cognition and an opening in political action. And the center stage here is occupied by, as we know, by the figure of science, or knowledge as a process without a subject, which implies a very peculiar deployment not only of Spinoza and Marx, but also of a certain Hegel, and which, according to Althusser, which would enable precisely the grasping of that which is left out and prohibited by the circular structure of interpellation, by the circular structure of ideology, complexity, multiplicity, singularity. Thus, historical materialism, or Althusser's entire celebration of Marx's discovery of the continent of history, as a continent or as a science, not of general laws and general determinations, but of singular conjunctions, of conjunctures. A Marx closer to Lenin than to the pedantry of value form theory. And the status of science, the status of research into scientificity, this needs to be really said at the very outset, is very peculiar, because even if it is invested in Althusser in a range of epistemological propositions or epistemological notions, even if it is formulated within a specific terrain of generality, of scientificity as such, or at least an attempt to map out the imminent development of different sciences, this theoretical investment is from the very outset oriented towards politics itself. It is a question not of science as such, but of science for politics, or a theory for politics. Why? Well, because in the last instance, Althusser believes that a ruptural political movement is impossible without a certain coupure, a certain cut in knowledge as such. A figure of political organization, a ruptural figure of political organization, is unthinkable without the intervention of a ruptural dimension of knowledge as such. But what is it that enables Althusser to pursue this path, and how does he construct this understanding of scientificity as a process without a subject? I think Althusser needs to be separated to a very large degree from the usual suspects, from the usual ways of situating him within the general terrain of structuralism. Because a process without a subject, in fact, implies a very peculiar combination of themes of structure on the one hand, and on the other hand, the theme of the dialectic. And at the same time, a recourse to a series of concepts which are constructed without any reference to subject or subjectivity. Mechanism, process, tendency, production, transformation, instruments of production, and so on and so forth. But what is often overlooked is the fact that Althusser attempts to dialecticize structure twice and not only once. In fact, we have two proposals of the dialectics of structure. On the one hand, something which is quite explicit, structural dialectic, or structural causality. This is precisely the famous theme of the complex whole structured in dominance, where the interplay between determination and domination takes center stage, and determination, as understood as a cause present in its effects, never determines things directly, but determines the incessant displacement of the functions of domination in an articulated system of differences. The question of what is primary and what is secondary. And here, of course, we have a certain entire terrain of concepts which are deployed precisely in this direction, namely the concept of overdetermination, an excess of multiple determinations, but also concepts such as condensation and displacement, allowing for the intelligibility of the concrete without reducing its complexity, the intelligibility of the singular without swallowing it up within a generality. So this is one aspect of the dialecticization of structure, a structural dialectic. But at the same time, there is something which I would propose to call a dialectic of structure itself. A certain immanent self-production of structure, where the key problem is not simply the intelligibility of an object, but the production of concepts themselves. This is the famous theme that we find already in Pour Marx of the movement of generalities in the production of knowledge. Generality 1, 2, and 3, as Althusser would single it out, which is no doubt modeled upon Spinoza, the Spinozist three kinds of knowledge, where knowledge itself is presented as a singular production of concrete concepts through an engagement of specific general theoretical means of production which transform themselves and in fact more radically produce themselves in their own operation, in their own working through the conceptual material at hand. We have a proposal for a dialecticization of concepts and categories, which are not simply fixed points in a process of knowing, but that which changes shape incessantly. And this is precisely the terrain upon which Althusser would elaborate his own theory of the symptom, a non-psychoanalytic theory of the symptom, namely the famous theme of symptomal reading. What is symptomal reading? It is the process of the production of knowledge via the progressive incorporation of exceptions and singularities. It is the extension, the incessant extension of structure in order to include exceptions. The production of singular combinations of concepts, which also retroactively constantly transform structures. Althusser's famous example for that is, of course, given in L'Ire le Capital, in his attempt to explain the originality of Marx's endeavor itself. Namely, within Marx, within the theoretical problematic of Marx, the eruption of an answer which does not have a problem. The eruption of a concept which cannot be rendered intelligible within the field of the existent theoretical problematic. So, answers without questions, answers which are unintelligible within the current combination of concepts and problems, and thus which precisely set in motion the production of a new problematic. Althusser would, in this sense, speak about the practical existence of concepts, which demand a movement of theoretical reflexivity. And this is precisely what his early definition of philosophy as theory of theoretical practice is invested in. Namely, it is the production via a concept which emerges as an excess, the production of its own presuppositions as a result. But at the same time, there is a specific vector in this movement of knowing. And this is something which Althusser certainly borrows from the French rationalist embrace of Spinozism. It is specifically something which he borrows from Bachelard, if not from Cavaillés, and if not even earlier from Braunschweig, namely the idea that form as such is generative. The question of form is not a matter of receptivity, but of donation, but of generation. Namely, there is a vector of the passage in the incessant production of knowledge by the incorporation of exceptions. Each passage into a new problem, into a new problematic, implies a further liberation of concepts from accidentality and intuitive concepts. In a certain sense, each passage is the continuation of the coupure, of the separation of the concept from empirical intuitions as such, producing ever more complex and ever more singular articulations. Because precisely it is the concept which for Althusser lies at the center of the problem of what makes singularity intelligible. How can the concept, as something abstract, provide cognition or intelligibility of singularity? Because it is itself a synthesis of multiplicity of conceptual relations. Its sense is given only within the system or within a complex systematic interrelation of a field of problems. So one does not begin with definitions, with clear and distinct ideas. Definitions are only obtained, or the clarity of a concept is only obtained as a result, as the result of the process of knowing, as a certain result of a synthesis. And the paradox of this conception of knowing is that singularity and multiplicity are grasped precisely under the growing relations of conceptual necessity. Namely, concepts as rational objects are precisely more singular and more specific to the degree that the determinations under which they are formed and submitted are more necessary and abstract. The more necessity within concepts, the more evacuation of intuitive contents, the more complex its conceptual articulations are, the more concepts are capable of grasping singularity. The richer, or the more concrete are the relations which are grasped by conceptual articulation. So the entire problem of a univocity of a concept is not simply a matter of a separation of a concept from experience, from ordinary language, but precisely as a complex synthesis. Univocity is obtained as a result. Now, I have said that this entire path of the conception of knowledge is already formulated somewhere else. It is invested in something else, in politics. And the question is precisely, is this all there is beyond interpellation? A certain conceptual movement, a certain autonomy of the process of knowledge. Because how can Althusser, despite himself, despite his insistence or a Spinozist repetition of the fact that the concept of the dog does not bark, how can Althusser produce a specific concept which barks, a concept which intervenes historically, a concept for politics, a concept fused with a political movement as such? This is where the problem of politics, in fact, emerges as a further terrain and a certain ruptural excess. This is where Althusser progressively starts to realize that the process without a subject, in fact, needs to be doubled. It is not one terrain, but there are two terrains. And this is the site of Althusser's self-criticism of his theoreticism. In a text called Marx's Relation to Hegel, in one of the first formulations of this text, Althusser, in fact, delivers a stark verdict on his own failures. In order to, I'm quoting here, in order to exit the circle, and the circle is precisely the incessant movements of the abstraction of the concept, the constant symptomal reading, in order to exit the circle of the concept, one needs to pass through the experience of class struggle. This is what Althusser claims. In the same text, he would also say the following: only the militants of class struggle know what a process under relations is. We need to learn from them, or we need to learn around them precisely the fact that they already know. In the famous response to John Lewis, he would take this further. Communists can help scientists to understand what a process without a subject is. What is at stake here? Well, first, there is a specific movement, which I don't have time to trace now here, but a specific movement away from, not without a certain dose of embarrassment in Althusser's term, a certain proto-Hegelianism of the status of the concept. Because Althusser had literally attempted to think Marxist politics as a certain extension of the concept, in Hegelian terms, as the being there of the concept. He spoke he would speak in this sense of the practical works of Marxism, for instance, Lenin's political practice, as the invention of the theoretical concept of the problematic. But all this is internal to a specific movement of the concept. Or he would, at another instance, he would speak about theoretical inventions which proceed directly from political practice, running ahead of the current state of theory. The problem that he faces, and in fact, this is a problem which determines the entirety of Althusser's philosophical vacillations, the constant shifts of terrain, ending in the famous aleatory phase. The problem constantly revolves around the unsituatability of politics itself, which is not reducible to the concept, because the famous fusion of theory and practice within the Marxist-Leninist parties still guards the classical dialectical conception. It guards a unity of opposites. So politics is not really the extension of the concept, but it does also not belong to the category of the subject, to the category of experience, to the category of ideology. So what is this experience of class struggle that Althusser speaks about? Alain Badiou, in his Métapolitique, has proposed the following possible readings. In Althusser, we have a conception of subjectivity without the subject. I would attempt, by way of concluding, this on elaborating of what Badiou would mean by this, by attempting to show how in Althusser himself there is a specific conception of politics, of political subjectivity, which is divorced from experience in general, but which we can perhaps model under the idea of experimentation. So politics as a certain, this would be my proposal for a reading of what Badiou would mean by a subjectivity without a subject. Politics as a certain experimentation or an experimental dispositive of the conjuncture. An experimentation of the conjuncture. Of course, this is a very peculiar figure of experimentation because by contrast to science, we do not have controlled conditions. And we also do not have elements which can be defined in advance. But we have a constant mobility of determinations with reversals, bursts, a dynamic of forces, a shifting of positions, a constant crystallization of movement as such. We have an experimental dispositive which presupposes a constant singularity of combinations. Now, the key here is a specific temporality, because the temporality of the experimental dispositive of the conjuncture is a perspective of the radical present, of the moment as a point of the given moment, the actual moment, as a point which demands a decision. The figure of lost chances. In Lenin's famous formulation, this moment can pass, the change can be missed. So, unlike science, unlike the process of cognition, which captures the movement of its object within a certain terrain of necessity, of conceptual necessity, politics does not deal with objects, but it deals with specific objectives, establishing a line, moving forward, overturning. Namely, the object of politics, or the objective of politics, is struggle itself. Politics treats points, politics draws lines, point by point, thus not only rendering the conjuncture intelligible, but also by pointing towards possible ways of overcoming its extant structure, towards an opening, a transitory opening of possibilities, by drawing alliances, but also by affirming unforeseen forces and capacities. Thus we have the classical arsenal of concepts: leadership, organization, line, strategy, tactics, forms of action, modes of work, education, orientation. Now, the entire question of knowledge, the question of the concept, is not separate from this experimental dispositive, but it is transformed into something else. It functions in a different way, and specifically it functions in a different temporality, in a different guise. For instance, concepts which function as slogans. Politics in its experimental dispositive is a way of treating the conjuncture. And this needs to be taken in a double sense. The treating of the logic of forces, the extant logic of forces as a certain material objectivity, but at the same time as the affirmation of the emergence of a new capacity of force as an exception. A certain subjective prescription, a new unpredictable force as a force of transformation, which cannot be simply deduced from a logic of power. Althusser, in fact, proposes both. In fact, there are two modalities in the experimental dispositive of politics. Demarcation, on the one hand, against the reduction of politics to existent forms, against what Lenin would call, for instance, parliamentary cretinism, the constant affirmation of a new form of politics, a ruptural form of politics. The question is precisely the question of a constant drawing up of autonomy, but at the same time a certain indication, a certain projection, a certain attempt to capture new points, new capacities. But what we have here in the end is a certain interrelation between two terrains. And I think this is precisely where Althusser can be seized in a specific contemporaneity. Because unlike for Badiou, there is not simply an attempt to think politics from the immanence of its intellectuality. It is imperative to think politics together with knowledge, to think together the objectivity of the concept and a certain opening of political possibilities as such. The concept is necessary, for instance, to render intelligible or to render rational a political decision taken in a terrain of contingency. But at the same time, politics as excessive to the concept, communists teach the scientists by pointing to the incessant necessity of opening and producing new concepts. So, what is it that, in conclusion, lies beyond interpellation? A certain theory of political organization, a certain interplay between knowledge and politics, which is basically a theory of the Revolutionary Party.
Thank you very much, Ozren. It was interesting as always. So I look forward to see how the present here will discuss your rather singular reading of Althusser. Maybe to open a discussion, I'll start with a rather, simple remark. One of the things which I find rather interesting in the heritage of the French contemporary philosophy is a certain disinterest in Althusser, especially for those who were engaged more like in Lacan, taking Althusser as a certain step towards Lacan, not as an autonomous entity, so to speak. And therefore, which is, one can understand, follow and agree with your critique and reading of such an attempt, to sort of misrepresent, the radicality of Althusser's theory and his concepts, trying to align them too quickly would with Lacanian's concept, identified with Lacanian concepts, and missing, of course, the specificity of Althusser. I mean, my simple question would be the following: why do, in the present conjecture, which is for certain decades, it's not now, why do you think, Althusser was a victim of a certain conjecture and a certain reading?
Large question, difficult question, which certainly presupposes an examination of a series of things from a certain division of labor within the Althusserian camp, which, in as much as it was productive, perhaps was also unproductive, because to a very large degree, Althusser was reduced to the aspect of his theory of society and theory of history, which obscuring the proper philosophical originality of his project. And perhaps this was his own fault, in as much as he invested most of his students' work, Balibar, Macheret, Péchaud, and others, in the extension of the theoretical problematic precisely in the direction of a theory of history or a theory of society. At the same time, the political conjuncture, the rise of French Maoism, and the specific reorientation of the group of his students, initially oriented around Cahiers pour l'analyse and Cahiers marxiste-léniniste, towards Lacan, and towards a certain more radical grasping of the dialectic itself. Now, what I always found interesting is that, for instance, Badiou's personal trajectory, which is precisely Sartre to Althusser, Althusser to Lacan, and then to himself to a certain degree, but I would say that the Badiou of Lettres l'Événement, the post-dialectical Badiou, is to a very large degree a return to a series of Althusserian themes, to Althusserian problematics. The entire figure of the state for Badiou, I think, is entirely modeled in terms of Althusser's understanding of the state, the understanding of ideological state apparatuses, the understanding of interpellation, even the critique of the law as a separate form and separate instance. Now, of course, the concession that Badiou is not prepared to make is the opening towards what Althusser represents to understand under the general terrain of knowledge. Of course, truths are irreducible to the representation of history. History does not exist. Even if recently Badiou has, under the guise of the figure of the idea, has returned to a certain thinking of the articulation of principles and singularities as such. So I would say the fate of Althusser is complex, perhaps also due to the singular nature of his personal tragedy in the last instance. But and something which I forgot to mention, of course, is his attachment to a certain French institutional context of politics, namely the entirety of his interventions around the reinvention of a revolutionary figure of the party, the reinvention of a form of thought which would precisely respond to the strategic injunctions of the present, were formulated within the confines of the French Communist Party, within the confines of a certain closure of political possibilities, which Althusser's students and those who have criticized him already rejected. So this is where I would read, in all these things is where I would read the obscurity of Althusser today.
Jan, sorry, I think.
You can do.
Yeah.
Thanks. Two smaller questions. The first one, I think, follows up on Jalis's question. Okay. Yeah? No.
No, it
I don't think so. But
Yeah.
yeah, now. Okay. So I have two smaller, minor questions, and I think the first one follows up on Jelits's. So you gave, when you began your talk, you gave it a kind of historical index, no, referring to a certain reading which has happened at a certain time in a specific place, namely here. So you decided to pick Ljubljana as the place where to kick out the Lacanians out of the Althusserian reading. And now I'm wondering, at the end, you come back, and now in your answer as well, you come back to the problematic of the Revolutionary Party, no? And so to put it very brutally, do you think the Lacanian reading is a kind of blockage to, let's say, leftist thought of communism at this time, theoretical thought in philosophy? Part A. Part B is, well, I was wondering whether you are somehow then taking a kind of a Spinozist turn by trying to kick out the figure of the subject, and by then, on the other hand, inscribing the need for everything which was supposed to be on the form of the subject into the structure itself. So you have a structure which is actually genetic and also changing by itself. It's actually a form of a becoming in a certain moment. But then, I mean, in Althusser, you could say, well, okay, to a certain extent, it is nevertheless de-dialecticized because precisely it then refers in the end to science. No, there is a kind of an objectivity of science which is then linked again to Marxism. So my second question would be, has two moments actually. Would, in your understanding, what would we have as the objective ground for this science? Is this for you Marx then? And second part, is then there a need for a party in that sense as we had it already before, namely as the, let's say, second phase of communism, of the communist hypothesis? Is that which you would go along with then? So are we back to the second hypothesis?
The answer to the first question is no. Of course, there were formulations by Badiou himself, for instance, in Théorie du Sujet, of a Lacanian theory of the party, or at least of a Lacan-inspired, based possibility of thinking a ruptural revolutionary political organization, which is different from Althusser to a very large degree, in as much as it has the difference would be the difference between, let's say, Lenin and Mao in the last instance. But Yu's figure of a revolutionary organization is within the Théorie du Sujet is formulated upon a fundamental intuition of Mao, the intelligence, the fundamental creative intelligence of the masses themselves. Whereas Althusser's theory is still Leninist in its texture, namely, there needs to be, at the center stage, there needs to be a thinking of the encounter between knowledge, between theory or science formulated outside of a political subjectivity as such, and a rupture of political subjectivity as such. How to relate this to the phases of the communist hypothesis in Badiou? Tricky and difficult question, which one would have to answer first by attempting to dismantle Badiou's periodization as such. Namely, I think a certain import of Althusser is that, for instance, he never abandons the classical Marxian dialectical schemas of the possibility of the end of the state. This is why the sequences, in a certain sense, are, even if there is an emphasis on the infinity of the process, the infinity of political struggle and transformation, there is a conception of everything is inserted in the conception of the end of the state as such. So, politics at a distance of the state, and on the other hand, the figure of the dictatorship of the proletariat as the possibility of the end of the state. So, this is one thing. But second, I'm not sure that I'm prepared to so fast to sacrifice the dimension of knowledge or the dimension of history. I think there's still more to be thought, and perhaps Badiou himself goes in this direction after his split with Lazarus. There's more to be thought in politics and for politics apart from the immanent terrain of subjectivity as such, from the immanent terrain of truths in politics as prescriptions, as subjective prescriptions as such. There is something productive in thinking the encounter between knowledge and political action. And in this sense, Althusser's formulation of a theory of the party is not the classical. It's a, let's call it a post-Leninist theory of the party, in as much as it is formulated, one can find this in his texts of the 70s, and specifically in his late text of the 70s, one can find it precisely beyond the classical dialectical figure of fusion. The party is not anymore the fusion of theory and practice, but an encounter between theory and practice. Althusser would go as far as saying that Marx himself, and now to return to your question about objectivity, Marx himself, or from within Marx himself, one cannot say anything about politics. One cannot seize politics proper in its modes of radical contingency. He also says Lenin and Mao have only come halfway, and the only thinker who has properly seized politics in its singularity is Machiavelli. And in Althusser's reading of Machiavelli, we have this strange understanding, very peculiar understanding of the relationship between theory or knowledge and politics as a certain production of a gap within the concept itself. Theory stages a certain scenario, a certain terrain of the object, precisely which includes a gap, a void, which is to be filled by an eruption of a ruptural political practice, which cannot be theorized or captured or stabilized by the concept in advance. So, literally, there is something radically ventral of politics, irreducible to the concept as such. But one needs to think the explosive articulation of theory producing this void within the concept and the actual eruption of political possibilities as such. Theory does not simply make a propaganda for politics, but clears a certain space for it. I would say that it points towards, without anticipating it, points towards a specific opening. Now, if just one further very brief thing, Althusser's entire philosophical project, as we know, has figured around a specific temporality. Now, if Badiou is a thinker of eternity, Althusser is a thinker of the singular moment. And he reduced philosophy in its form to the capturing of the singular moment. Philosophy does not deal with concepts. Philosophy does not articulate anything of consistency. Philosophy is an incessant intervention. This is why philosophy thinks through theses, or as Althusser would call them, conclusions without premises.
Jana?
Thank you so much. I think it's you're kind of a mix of Althusser, Lacan, and Badiou. It's a bit of a disjunction because obviously we have three very different figures of the subject, and even the very definition of the subject is completely different. On the side of Althusser, sort of a negative subject, the missing subject, which then at the end, however, as you said, kind of ends up coming back in the form of the subjective figure of a communist, right, who has to teach the scientist. So as if the subject ended up somehow re-emerging after its absence. Then, in Lacan, obviously the subject which is there, but then he kind of traces his entire topology through, the kind of a psychoanalytic apparatus and so on. And then in Badiou, the subject is something that's not given, but that only emerges, in this kind of eventual process. When I was listening to you, especially at the end, I was kind of, and I think there was one point when you mentioned Spinoza, I was kind of asking myself, what's the, this eternal question, like where is Spinoza in Althusser? And it actually sort of just made me think that perhaps, in fact, when he spoke about the Marxist politics as the being there of the concept, in fact, I have almost the feeling as if Althusser was making the Marxist politics into the God of Spinoza. You know, kind of, it's everywhere, but in the same way, it's nowhere, you know, it's like everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And therefore the subject, thus the communist, you know, kind of like if he wants to rediscover this omnipresent God, therefore the Marxist politics, it sort of reminds me the fourth, sections part of Spinoza's Ethics, where he talks about, you know, how after the truth that indexes itself, and then he talks about this impossibility of sin, because sin is impossible because we have the God in ourselves. Therefore, if we're reasonable, you know, if we act reasonably and not according to passions and desire, we cannot be sinful. Therefore, if Marxist politics is as the place of the God, like if we kind of almost, it's almost as if we had it in ourselves, and therefore we couldn't be political renegades, you know, or we couldn't be. It's just like he's almost kind of Spinozizing somehow Marxist politics, and I find it really delirious in a certain way. One thing that always like bothered me when you came to this notion of the state apparatus and the reproduction of relations of production is the kind of extreme simplicity of Althusser's little text, because I think that, especially in this part, I think that in the interpellation itself, like the way how I have the feeling he kind of describes it is almost as if, and when I get also from your talk, is as if there was some sort of a, first infinity, which then is kind of made finite into this finite form of the subject through the interpellation. Whereas I think what Althusser kind of doesn't perhaps mention, because it's also just such a short, undeveloped paper, is that, you know, if there's an interpellation, well, there necessarily has to be a certain remainder of that interpellation. It's not like the infinity is made into the finitude, but I think it's rather the interpellation kind of drives a split into, you know, and divides the subject, and therefore there must be some, sort of a remainder in that division. Because I think what I wanted to ask you, that the interpellation, besides the interpellation, the reproduction of relations of production is not done only through interpellation, but it's also done through the other terms of Marx, like, commodity fetishism, which, as you mentioned, for Althusser is kind of problematic. And even like if we think of today, primitive accumulation, how capitalism always kind of sees these new spheres of life and kind of reifies them into those sort of commodities, that can be sold, whether through social networks or, housing, Airbnb, or even just life itself, So I always found this very problematic, and therefore I wanted to ask, and that's my question, if you could perhaps speak more about this role of commodity fetishism in Althusser, and why does he see it as so problematic? Or where does it fit into this scheme with interpellation?
Althusser would simply claim that in the chapter of commodity fetishism, Marx still plays too much on juridical categories, which he does not criticize. There is a certain reflection of the categories of the persona thing. The constant figure is a mirroring between persons, things. There's a presupposition of a specific, let's say, humanist capacity. And at the same time, occlusion, fetishism is seen as a certain spontaneous result of societal relations as such. Whereas he would insist that it is not a spontaneous result, it is an effect of the presence of a form. For instance, the form of juridical relations, of specific ideological forms as such. There's no spontaneity of commodity fetishism. One needs to presuppose the existence of theoretical categories of political economy, the juridical apparatus as such, moral ideology, and so on and so forth. So Marx, at least in his first chapter on Capital, is too short in explaining the mechanism of commodity fetishism. Now, on your second point about the subject, I was precisely trying to avoid the idea that interpellation, there's something genetic in interpellation, that there is something before and an after. Althusser does not claim that. He literally claims that individuals are always already subjects. It is not a question, as it will be for Lacan in his theory of the subject, of the passage from individuation to subjectivation, of before and an after, of multiplicity, which is then, how did you describe it? Infinity, which is finitized. Because there is a simultaneity of the functioning of interpellation. It is precisely the mechanism of the constant production of evidences as ideological evidences, the constant occlusion of a certain synchronicity in its functioning, the constant occlusion of a specific process. Because if we read this back into Lacan, if we insert the theory of the subject here, then we get back to a specific dynamism, because then we can claim that there is a lack, there is a reminder, as you pointed out, and that this can be salvaged for political terms, that one can precisely derive from the articulation of the void and the lack, one can derive specific political possibilities from the dysfunctioning of interpellation. But Althusser's opposition is simple, as you pointed out, but it's brutal. The dividing line is, on the one hand, we have a terrain of repetition, a terrain of subjectivity, and literally we need to go as far as claiming that for Althusser, each societal practice is ideological. Each societal practice, basically, in the last instance, is the functioning of the state apparatus as such. And the only exit points from that are knowledge and politics. And to simplify matters, I would say that for Althusser, all there is are a multiplicity of practices, except that there is knowledge and politics as processes without a subject.
Alexei?
Yeah, okay. I guess maybe, I also have two questions. I'll try to keep them brief. And maybe, the first question you might have touched on also in your response now. But I guess the question would be is to what extent, because if I understood the sort of trajectory of the paper, where in particular, so you begin with this sort of the critique of the attempt to reintroduce the problematic of the subject within an Althusserian register, but at the end you sort of turn to Badiou's metapolitics and this sort of formulation of the subjectivation without subject.
Subjectivity.
Or subjectivity without subject. And I guess the question is to what extent do you deem Althusser's effort to purify, we could say, the theory of history from subjectivity? To what extent do you deem that a success? Because if I understood the movement of your argument, which was precisely sort of really precise in terms of introducing these double moments within, on the one hand, the process without subject, and then a double moment within the dialectics of structure. That this secondary moment, which also is the sort of, I would say, leaning on the later Althusser's self-criticism of his own theoreticism and the reintroduction of the moment of class struggle or practice into theory itself, that this moment, we could say, could be understood in terms of, let's say, a certain understanding of the subject as, on the one hand, a formalist understanding of the subject, which you criticized as having this Kantian legacy, which we could say, the subject that is divided, versus, let's say, a splitting of the subject, where in some sense what's prior is the split to the moment of the subject. So in some sense there's an inversion that takes place where what is being thought is the moment of the action of the subject versus, let's say, the idea of a formal subject that precedes and is then therefore the guarantor of the moment of recognition. So that in other words, it seems like, if I understood the trajectory of your reading, to some extent, Althusser himself has to reintroduce a certain, let's say, criticized moment of the subject in order to maintain the priority of practice over theory, and therefore the priority of materialism over theoreticism. So that's the first question, which maybe that's more than enough. The second question was just a quick one, which is why I would say if that reading is correct, I think therefore, one also then would have to criticize, let's say, this moment of objectivism in Althusser, where what is lacking, let's say, is in some sense the precision of the distinction that's like not only Badiou but others introduced between, let's say, knowledge and truth. Like, in other words, precisely the reintroduction of that cut allows for a thinking of the problematic that you so, I think, isolated within Althusser, but, whether the question is whether Althusser has the adequate, formalization of it. But anyways, that's yeah.
Well, first, Spinoza, just to answer on that. I think the only thing that Althusser literally takes from Spinoza is the theories of knowledge. He doesn't take seriously the aspects of the theory of substance. And he takes the question of the theory of knowledge in a very peculiar sense, because he thinks literally that there's a dialectical passage between 1, 2, and 3. The third kind of knowledge being the intuitive knowledge, being a possible capturing of singularities. And this is a way of answering your question about objectivity, the second question, because what is the work of the concept and the determination of the concept that Althusser ends up with? In the last instance, it is the capturing of singularity qua multiplicity. This is the trajectory. The more concepts are abstracted, formalized, worked upon, or subtracted from intuitive empirical determinations, the more they're apt, precisely because of their complexity, the more they're apt of capturing a singularity. But what does this mean? This means that we need to translate this intuitively to terms that Althusser works with, which are always terms of a specific knowledge for politics. It means that we have a possibility of formalizing a theory of the conjuncture. We have a possibility of producing a knowledge which is not simply the objectivity of general laws or general determinations, but which can precisely seize singular moments, singularities in history, but without abandoning the train of generality at the same time. One can think together the movement of principles, the movements of general objectivities, and singular instances as such. And now, just to give an illustration, the way in which I would read it is that, for instance, classical objective categories such as class are mobile categories. They're not simply locatable within one sphere, but they're constantly shifting. They're determinations or over-determinations rather than concrete determinations as such. This is why over-determination is a central concept, because the question is precisely how to constantly capture the shifting determinations within the political present. Because the unfolding of history is not something distant. It is in actuality and under the injunction of acting upon this actuality. And now, this is where Althusser recognizes himself a limit, because again, it's a question of temporality. The concept cannot really bark. The concept is always only retrospective in the last instance. One can only know what exists. One cannot anticipate. But one can not figure the concept in the radicality of the present. In order for the concept to act, to pass into political action, it needs to pass into something else. And this is, I think, what Althusser attempts to think with the idea of the primacy of politics, with the idea of primacy of practice, or with the idea that I try to elaborate here of politics as an experimental dispositive, as a certain way of translating concepts in the temporality of the present, in a certain strategic thinking from the point of view of taking decisions in the present, and not simply knowing the present. So the question of the work of the concept changes here, because the concept provides a specific line of orientation now. It is not retrospective anymore. It can actually work in the present as such. It can be co-present to the unfolding of the present of politics. But one needs a different register, and I think Badiou is right to call this a subjectivity, but it is not yet a subject, because it is not, at least in Althusser, formalized as an immanent expansion of a capacity. It is still somewhere between a thinking of the present as, for instance, the constant interplay between the logic of forces and the eruption of something new. She agrees with that, or disagrees.
Thank you very much. I think we have to stop now in order to be able to hear Uroš Kranj's paper and discuss it. Thank you. Thank you very much.